Hey, it's Mr. Beat. Happy Labor Day, and I have a JJ with me here. There,
Hey,
hey,
there's there he is. How's it going?
morning there. Good. Happy Labor Day.
Happy Labor Day to us all.
Yes, I've been working all day.
Me
And I'm
too,
sure
actually.
yeah, I figure you probably were too. Yeah, we just kind of, we love it. So, but yeah, I wanted us to get philosophical tonight. So I kind of pitched this idea to you, like, hey, you want to like really examine that big question: what does freedom really mean? Um, yeah. So that's why we're here, I guess. And actually, we don't know why we're here. What is the meaning of life? But another time, another stream.
That's the next live stream.
Yeah, but thanks for being here, everyone. I'm supposed to. Mrs. Beat has given me an assignment to promote my mug. I put on the. Oh, I forgot to put it in the description. Crap. Anyway, I'm selling my compared mug. It's you get 10% off today only. I've pinned the comment, but if you just search Mr. Beat compared mug, it pops right up. It has like a bunch of my compared thumbnails on it that I've done for the series. So, but yeah,
You have one right now, Matthew?
no, we ordered one, but it's at my in-laws. Actually, I have other dorky mugs back there, like my Supreme Court mug. That's which I don't sell that on my store, but you can purchase it probably. Have you ever seen those?
No, show me. I like to see knickknacks.
Yeah, well, George is in there, but we got whoop. And so when you drink it, when you add hot water, hot anything, and liquid in there, the winner is all that remains of that case.
That's
So,
brilliant. Oh, that's
yeah.
awesome. Did you buy that at the Supreme Court in Washington?
No, I don't remember where I got this. When I went to the Supreme Court in Washington, yeah, we couldn't go in. You weren't able to go in either, were you?
No, I could. Although I was able to get much closer than you can get these days. I have like photos of myself, like just hanging out with the columns, just standing right up close to the door.
I did. Well, I did too. They only closed it after the Jackson v. Dobbs decision, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Crazy there. Oh, there it is. The mug is here. Thank you.
Oh, snap!
This is the mug. Okay, so if you get this is what. Yeah, sorry.
That's very cool.
Oh, gosh, I'm really bad at this. So yeah, it's make a great Labor Day gift. 10% off today. Okay, now that that's
out. The Home Shopping Network we're finished.
All right. So anyway, let's start with the question. Like, we all in our heads already know what freedom is, I think. And I don't want us to define that, but I would say, like, I'm going to make the assumption, JJ, that you think freedom is a good thing, right? You like freedom?
I am pro freedom. Yes.
Yeah, me too. And I think I've pretty much my entire life, like, built my whole identity on that. Like, my political ideologies I've had, even like, you think about it, like how you live your life, everything revolves around like, I do what I want to do. And, we are taught at a young age, you can't always do what you want to do, because what you do sometimes negatively hurts other people. But I think over time, like, we kind of forget that basic thing when we start to like look at, especially politics. So yeah, like,
were you really rebellious as a kid?
No.
Where's the root come from then? Like,
honestly, I follow the rules, but like, kind of like in my little fantasy world, I was like, in my head anyway, I was always like, I'm going to do things the opposite of what people want, as long if I can get away with it, like trying not to conform when I, whenever possible. Of course, that's not really possible much. Just trying to, like I can't stand it when things are just so cliche and like everyone, like, hi, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? No, I would say go out of my way to say something weird. I love uncomfortable moments, awkward moments. Yeah. Just, you probably know that from me, just knowing me. But just doing things differently, just to push the envelope. Not like an edgy comedian, but just like constantly getting ourselves uncomfortable, for the sake of, I guess, trying to see if this is a simulation or not. I guess I don't know, but anyway.
But I mean, like that follows, because I feel like one of the big sort of aspects of freedom, like it is impossible to sort of like define freedom without conceptualizing, I think, an enemy of freedom. And I feel like from what I know of you, that you've been a guy that has been very sort of preoccupied with the idea of enemies of freedom, right? And so I think that some people have a worldview, a sort of political worldview, that places that kind of force as one of sort of like the central sort of orienting points of their understanding of the world and society, is that sort of like society is fundamentally defined by people who are trying to take freedom away. And thus your kind of role as a citizen is to be sort of vigilant in opposition to this kind of sort of shadowy force. And I kind of feel like that's been a pretty consistent sort of theme of the way that you've viewed the world and sort of how you process politics and your own political identity. And even in like your videos and stuff, when you, the way you analyze American history and all that.
Oh, it's a very American thing. I would say even people that are on, like, I would say the far left end of the spectrum value freedom. And that's one big reason why I wanted to talk about this, because like it doesn't matter what your political beliefs are, you value freedom, it seems like. And like even like the Taliban, I bet you if you were to ask the typical member of that government, they'd be like, yeah, we love freedom. Yeah. And so it's one of those things, like it's universal. We all have different interpretations of it.
Yeah, and everybody sort of conceptualizes it differently, and they conceptualize it in terms of like the big dividing line, I think, is really kind of like the negative freedom versus the positive sort of freedom, right? Like the classic freedom from, freedom to, right? And I think that, like, in societies that we imagine as being oppressive, they would sort of define, I think, much more likely to have an orientation based around freedom to, right? Whereas I think that we, in a kind of more liberal democratic society, imagine the freedom from. Although that's not to say that, we obviously have freedom to is a huge part of our conception of freedom as well. But I feel like our default line is closer to freedom to, and historically the freedom from, I should say, is more close to our sort of historical baseline. And then freedom to stuff, I think, is a little bit more modern, more recent. Do you think that's true?
Yeah. Well, I might be like saying this wrong, but I've always just said, instead of saying freedom from or freedom to, I say civil liberties versus civil rights. I even made a little short about it. Like the difference, like civil liberties is freedom from oppressors, usually the government. Yes. And civil rights are it's freedom, like you need the people in power to help you, because your peers are taking away your freedom. So, for example, civil liberties might be like, privacy, like the government's taking away your right to whatever you want to do in the privacy of your home. Whereas civil rights is like somebody's trying to take away your right to vote. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, essentially, though, that's, I think, where the most of the political disagreements that we have, no matter where we are on the political spectrum, revolve around our different interpretations of civil rights versus civil liberties, or freedom from and freedom to. It's just, thank you guys. You got some fans here.
That's fun. Genetically modified skeptic. Oh boy,
is that the genetically?
I have no reason to believe it's not. He's a great guy. One of my favorite YouTubers.
Yeah, I watch you. Big fan. Yeah.
Yeah. He's a true intellectual man who I'm sure has lots of thoughts on this topic better than we could express.
Oh, this is okay. This is off topic, but Jordan, like I would say research. Just go to usually each government has a website as far as the process. From the U.S. to Canada and vice versa. Oh yeah, it's funny because like JJ and I have talked about that. Like, what if we? Hey, I want to move to Canada, and he's like, well, I want to move to the United States. You know, maybe we'll just switch roles sometimes. It's actually,
we'll just secretly switch places in the dead of night. You know, I'll put on your glasses and hello, I'm Mr. Beat.
April Fool's
Supreme Court briefs. Let's go.
Yeah, but no. Trying to stay on topic here. One thing that's a good jumping off point too. I came across this article over the weekend. I put the link. It's Washington Post actually. I think I put a link in the description as well. Let me go ahead and share it with everyone.
Yeah, I found this to be a quite interesting, quite thought-provoking piece.
Yeah, so it's about Labor Day, and I'll just read like a little bit from it just to kind of give the audience a little. It says, when we ponder Labor Day, our minds appropriately turn to those who do our society's most punishing work and to the unions they organize to defend their interests. One word the day brings to mind is solidarity. But the day is only rarely associated with another word, just as important to its purpose, freedom. This is, I think, because most of our discussions of freedom focus on negative liberty, freedom from, or yeah, you brought that up already, or positive liberty, freedom too. Most Americans instinctively worry about coercion. I can never say certain words. I should probably give up communicating for a living. By government and the dangers of an overweening state. This concern can express itself differently across ideological lines, but it spans from left to right. Yet the freedom to accomplish one's ends is just as important, and its moral worth was recognized by our nation's founders when they proclaimed their devotion to not only life and liberty, but also the pursuit of happiness. So that is something that I think is totally related to what I wanted to bring up tonight, because for the vast majority of my life, I was of the mindset of kind of it's almost like American folk history, like related to the founding fathers, like, and, you know, our independence from Britain, the oppressors who were taxing us, and they were making us do all these things we didn't want to do, despite the fact that we had no say. We had no say, and they were forcing us to do stuff, basically. And I say we as if I was there, but no, of course I would. That's a ridiculous thing too. So yeah, like I think that began to change when I was in grad school, actually, when I was working on my master's in history. I started actually reading the words of Franklin Roosevelt, who I'm not the biggest FDR fan, actually, and especially when I was younger, like, because I just thought that a lot of what his New Deal programs were harmful for the country and actually did more harm than good. You know, I was somebody raised on Reagan, you know, like the government's not the solution, the government is the problem. But it got me changing completely, like thinking about things in a new way when I read what he said. Yeah. So what would you say you align more with, Reagan or FDR? I would assume Reagan, right?
I guess so. I mean, what I thought was sort of like, in the sense that I'm probably conceptualize freedom more as a freedom from than a freedom to kind of guy. But what I thought was interesting in this article was that it kind of made the case that sort of the freedom from conception, the more sort of conservative conception of freedom, is based around the idea that the primary enemy of freedom is the government, right? Like, is the state. And I think that, like, you know, when you think of somebody like Ronald Reagan, you know, they conceptualized their idea of freedom as a kind of opposition to communism, which is sort of seen as the most totalitarian and oppressive form of government that sort of enslaves the individual and limits his ability to pursue happiness in that sort of sense. In particular, like in the context of like the idea of entrepreneurship is like a great sort of exercise of freedom, right? Like that you have a freedom to be an entrepreneur and build your own business and sort of collect the the income that you deserve, the fruit of your labor, all the rest of it, right? Yeah. But what this piece did that I think was kind of interesting was that it sort of conceptualized the idea that sort of an equal enemy of freedom can be the employer. Right? Like that in many ways, like the employer is the more oppressive force that we experience in our day-to-day lives. You know, the employer is what restricts our individual freedom. And and limits our ability to truly sort of pursue our happiness, right? So it's like, I wrote some notes down actually when I was thinking of this, right? So it depends like what you view as being sort of like the biggest obstacle to pursue your happiness, right? So like I feel like the more right-wing conception is that you need to have safety and security, right? And if you have safety and security, including like the security of a sort of stable economic sort of system or whatever, then you are sort of truly free. But I feel like some of the more left-wing sort of conceptions of freedom, the sort of the freedom too, is the idea that you have to have like time and resources to pursue your happiness. And so I kind of think that when you think of like the labor union or the labor movement as one of the great defenders of freedom, it's the idea that the labor unions sort of defend your independence from just constant grueling labor with minimal compensation, and that by guaranteeing you more free time, I'm sure you've seen this meme before. Everybody always posts this on Labor Day. It's always like, the labor movement who brought you the weekend, right? It's like this idea that sort of the freedom to have time off, the freedom to have weekends, the freedom to have holidays and this kind of stuff, like that time that liberation from the bosses provides you is a crucial element of freedom. And then as well, sort of like the material wealth or material benefits that things like labor unions provide you is an essential ingredient of freedom too, right? So in the article, I believe they talk about things like, having health insurance, which is something that the employer provides you with. Like that is a necessary ingredient to be able to pursue the kind of happy life that you might not otherwise be able to. And same with, like fair compensation for your labor, right? By being able to gain that kind of material wealth, then obviously it opens up so many opportunities to live freedom in a meaningful way, right? Freedom is not merely an abstract sort of philosophical principle, but it can only be sort of realized if you are given certain things that allow you to sort of make real these abstract notions.
Right. You said the word security is something as like typically associated with the right end of the spectrum in terms of what they stress more important. But security it's such a broad term in itself. I mean, economic security is something I think that most, if not all, citizens would say is the top priority, because if you don't have economic security, then what else? I mean, that you're just in survival mode constantly. And
I was thinking more like security. Like I think the right wing sort of conception of security is like literal like national security, right? Like you need to have a strong national defense, protect your country from being invaded or conquered or this sort of thing.
Law and order, yeah, you betcha. Yeah. That I would definitely agree with that. And so I guess that should. And it's interesting too, like how the with the Democratic Party and Republican Party. I tweeted this the other day, but it seems more and more the Democratic Party is becoming the more law and order party, which is shocking to me. Like, and then the Republican Party is becoming more and more the freedom of speech party, which is also shocking to me because I remember even 10 years ago, it was not that case. But I think what happens ultimately with a lot of that is just it's self-serving for them to like, it's like, a lot of times it's just rhetoric, let's be honest. And then also freedom of speech is something we have to bring up because freedom of speech doesn't really exist. I think people think it's like a real thing, like you can just say whatever you want at any time. But even in the United States, that's just not the case. Like there are certain things we can't say at certain times. This is well established by the Supreme Court and all the courts really at every level. And so I think that's another misconception too. Like, why are they punishing this journalist, And for me, like one of the biggest problems I have with Abraham Lincoln is the fact that he threw journalists in jail, and Barack Obama did too. And then you look at what happened with Snowden and others that have released sensitive information, and I'm always on the side of them. But the older I get, the more I realize, like, hold on. If the speech that they release actually does directly lead to harm, when I say harm, I mean people could die. Is that really? is that really freedom? Because you're taking away the freedom of the people who may be in harm's way. And another, like the documents from Mar-a-Lago that they released to the public, like they wanted it transparency, but then they showed like redactions, and they explained, well, the redactions is to protect the FBI agents involved, or whoever was the judge, and everyone involved who might be in harm's way if it was released. And so, I guess, what are your thoughts on freedom of speech in particular?
Well, I mean, I think you've done a good job of sort of highlighting how, we all sort of have access to a great deal of freedom as a sort of matter of constitutional principle, but freedoms are often in conflict with each other, right? So in sort of some of these high profile cases like Snowden and Julian Assange and whatever, right? Like that there's this kind of sense that it's like, well, does the public's kind of, or does like an individual journalist's sort of freedom to publish whatever he wants, is that a more important sort of issue than the sort of the national security kind of conception, the right to average Americans to presumably sort of live in a state of security, like what we were talking about before, right? So it's like which freedom balances out the other. I often think that like when it comes to freedom of speech, one of the best examples of how the right is limited that we often kind of take for granted as just being sort of normal and don't really question is that like I do not have the right to go out and just like sell JJ's Disney coloring books or whatever with like Mickey Mouse and the Frozen characters, right? Like I could say like, this is like my freedom of speech. I should be able to like publish and sell whatever I want. But it's like, no, there's such things as copyright. I also can't go out and say that, Matthew Beat is a baby killer or whatever, right? Like I can't slander you, right? Like that's an exercise of my freedom of speech that I'm not allowed to indulge in our sort of societies, right?
But public figures, you can get away with that more.
To a degree, right?
Yeah.
Like you cannot, like I can't even sort of say like Joe Biden, murders children or whatever, right? Like you can still be sued even when it's public figures, right? Like there's it's true that in America, especially America actually does have much sort of broader protections for freedom of speech as it comes to slandering public figures than many other countries do.
It's really hard to win a lawsuit if you sue somebody for defaming you in the United States. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that. Outside the United States, they don't realize that. Yeah, and because it depends on like who sort of the onus is on, right? Which I guess is also conceptualized as freedom as well, right? So it's like, does my right, does my freedom to slander an individual supersede that individual's sort of right to be protected from slander? Like, do we have a reasonable entitlement to be free from people spreading malicious lies about us, right? Even if we are celebrities or whatnot. So it's interesting though, because I find myself, even when I'm talking about this, like the concept of a freedom versus a right can be a sort of a sticky sort of thing, right? Like you were talking about this concept in terms of civil rights and civil liberties, and is a right the same as a freedom? Here in Canada, right, like instead of having a Bill of Rights, we have a thing in our constitution that's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which are separated in the document as being like one half of it is your freedoms and then one half of it is your rights. And again, like you could say that this goes back to the, freedom from freedom to kind of dichotomy. But but even then, like you could sort of say, like when these two sort of concepts come into conflict, does freedom always triumph over right? And is that sort of perhaps the better way to think of it? And absence of things triumphs over a right to things. And when they come in conflict, I think that's when it's really difficult to reach a solution or compromise. And so what happens is there needs to be sides, and you need to hash it out. And that's why it's so there will always be opposite ends of the political spectrum for that reason alone. Like, because I've had people ask me, "You think there will ever be a time when there's not political division?" I just don't see that ever happening, because there's a need to debate, when rights and freedoms come in conflict with each other, and that's why it's so important to always have that. When it's actually, to me, terrifying when there's not constantly a debate going on in terms of rights and liberties. Yeah.
And presumably, like, this is what the judiciary is for, right? I mean, you've done so many of your Supreme Court briefs, Matthew, right? Where it's all presumably, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, like a lot of times the most high profile Supreme Court cases involve some degree of conflict between two different sort of interpretations of constitutional rights, correct?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the most high profile Supreme Court case recently in the United States, might as well bring it up. We already hinted at it earlier. The Jackson v. Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. For if you were living under a rock recently and didn't hear about it, it basically reversed the legalization of abortion nationwide. And so now we have states that have straight up outlawed abortion, kind of gone in the other extreme. And so, but that at its core, it's a debate about the right of the woman to choose to do what she wants with her body. But on the other side, they argue, well, what about the body, the life of the person inside of the woman? And then, but then you go, if you complicate it even further, you can say, well, okay, if you will argue that at conception, this, I don't know what they're called before embryo, but you know what I'm saying. At the early stages of pregnancy, the human inside, if you're going to say that they have the right to life at conception, then ought you to say that they have rights, all the other rights as well that we have after birth? And so that opens up the floodgates to me, and I don't hear that conversation even happening right now. Frankly, I don't. I mean, but
some Republicans want like personhood for the unborn to be explicitly recognized by the courts and the Constitution and that kind of thing, right? Which is
would open up the floodgates. Yeah,
it would extend the rights, because like this is sort of the other sort of complicated thing as well, is like, do different types of citizens have a different suite of rights, right? So it's like it's interesting that even like it's interesting because like even say like the moderate sort of Republican position on abortion, which is that, it is a person from the moment of conception, but, there are still reasonable grounds in which, the pregnancy can be terminated, the unborn child can be killed as they would conceptualize it, right? Which then suggests that even if you accept that, an unborn child is a person, is an American even, that an unborn person has different rights than a fully living person, right? Which seems odd on some level, but on the other hand, we kind of also conceptualize that, you're the suite of rights that you have access to, the suite of freedoms that you have access to, do differ based on, the type of American you are. Children are denied the right to vote. They don't have the freedom to choose their government, right? They have to live under the rule of the government just as much as anybody else does, but they don't have that freedom. Our courts and our sort of political culture have understood that that's a legitimate infringement on a certain class of persons' rights, right? So it is. And, like it goes, there's lots of different sort of manifestations of this that you could imagine, in which your group identity plays a role in, like you say Native Americans, for instance, they have unique rights that come from their sort of unique status in the American sort of legal system. There's probably other examples here in Canada, right? Like you could say that French Canadian people have special rights that are sort of enshrined in our Constitution. So it's as much as we want to sort of believe that freedom is a concept that can be sort of universally applied, we do constantly have to qualify it and granulate it and all the rest of it.
Too idealistic at this point still. Like, that's going to be a good segue in here in a moment. But first, before we get into that segue, I wanted to bring up, if you're not a citizen, that alone, if you look at Guantanamo Bay, the reason why there was very few punishments for those who tortured, and there's still, to this day, there are people at Guantanamo Bay who never have had due process. So they've had, and the reason why judges have not called it out is like, well, they're not citizens. It's only citizens that are protected, who get Bill of Rights protections. And not only that, the war on terrorism has really, the Barack Obama, another thing that he did that really was just something I was upset with was just suspects. They were suspected of being a terrorist, skipping right over even detaining them and just killing them. and then killing the son of the suspect. Like that something was that deeply disturbed me. But again, they are not American citizens, and so the citizenship thing also determines whether or not you get freedom. So.
Well, and like, and the concept of sort of due process, right? Like, because I think there actually were American citizens that have been killed in the War on Terror, and the argument would be that they have sort of due process rights that are obviously being sort of waived when you're just being killed, right? But on the other hand, you can also sort of say that, you could say that sort of like when a suspect is like shot in the course of a police interaction, a robber is shot as he's, running out of the place with the bags of money in his hands or whatever, like doesn't have his due process rights being respected in that context either, which again goes into the idea of, like, is this kind of this freedom, this concept of sort of security, right? Like, is that kind of like the highest goal, right? Because when people are being killed in times of war, I think the argument that sort of the courts generally defer to is the government's argument that we're doing this for the security, like we're doing this to preserve the national security of the nation, and that is like the highest good. And same with when a cop shoots somebody, the argument that the cops would make is that, well, we're upholding the sort of law and order of the society, and that, to protect everybody's freedom, you need to give us some degree of deference to just do what we think is right in the context of the moment. And if that means sort of like abridging other people's constitutional rights in some circumstances, you just kind of have to allow it, because that, they would say, is the price of freedom, right? Freedom isn't free. That's what the
freedom isn't free,
the folks like to say, right? And it's weird that the cost of freedom is other freedoms, right? So that's
yeah, it's the currency. It's also the currency. Okay, I better like get some of these super chats. I feel bad. Sorry, because the audience, sometimes we lose them. So Alex says hi. Hi, Alex. Thank you for the kind words. What are your thoughts on the fringe candidate for House of Representative North Dakota, Dixon Durhole? I'm not familiar with Dixon. Are you?
No,
okay, I have to look him up, though. Thanks for bringing them to our attention. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, well, thank you, Colton. That's really slang from the 1920s. That's I love it. Thank you. When is it okay to restrict freedoms? Is it ever okay? Yeah, I mean, we kind of already answered this, but see, like I even made a video early on about this, where I was just like, you can do whatever you should be able to do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anyone else.
Yeah.
But again, like there are scenarios where it gets freaking complicated. Yes. And another example we haven't brought up yet, and this also has got me thinking this past year or two, because like when they first started having mask mandates and, when the Biden administration started to like make federal employees get vaccinated, my first impulse was like, this is wrong. Like you can't, especially the vaccines, you can't force people to inject something into their body, and like the mask thing too, to a certain degree, although most of that was local. So which is, I think, kind of a good compromise, always localism. Like it shouldn't be a broad sweeping thing over an entire giant country. It should be state by state, county by county, city by city. But regardless, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, you know what? Freaking public health. Yeah. I mean, because you think about, you should have the freedom to go to the store and not worry about getting COVID or getting whatever, so that's also a freedom you're taking away from someone by choosing not to get vaccinated or wear a mask. And so I started to see that other side of it, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is the kind of thing that Roosevelt would have seen as being very clear cut, right? Like he would have sort of conceptualized it as that we have a freedom from the disease, right? Because, when you listen to sort of like how Roosevelt spoke during the sort of the four freedoms during, the Second World War and all of that, it was very much the idea that we have, and this I guess also goes to the sort of the concept of security, but the idea that we have a fundamental freedom from preventable danger, right? Like that if government can do what it's needs to do to protect us, to protect the citizenry from harm, government should do that. And so I think that would sort of be the argument, and this was the argument when it came to things like masks and vaccines and so forth, is that the government's higher order obligation is to protect the maximum number of people from getting this terrible disease, not, you know, the freedom of an individual to not wear the mask or whatever. That these sort of things are not equal in importance, that the freedom from the illness matters a great deal more.
Thanks, Colton, for another great segue, because like something else that Franklin Roosevelt brought up that made me question my own beliefs was one of his 4 freedoms was freedom from want. And this, like, if you think about it, you know, many of us, you could technically call us slaves because we are slaves to either a system, or we are stuck in a job that we hate, or we're stuck in a situation we can't get out of. Because if we try to get out of it, it means that, or if we do get out of it, it means we might not make it, period. So like, I know that's like a different type of slavery than what we traditionally think of, like chattel slavery and all that. But I mean, like, yeah, what's your thoughts on this idea, like financial freedom being something like, freedom from want, I guess, that whole idea.
Well, it's interesting because as I've become successful in my life, as I've been, you know, a successful YouTuber and this sort of thing, and I have been making more money, and I do realize that, like, it is a freeing experience, right? To be more wealthy than I've previously been, and to be as independent financially as I am. Like, just from my personal perspective, I realize like how much freedom I have, and even how much freedom I have in relation to my friends or just like other people. You know, I can just afford to buy things that I want and not have to like stress out about them. If some sort of crisis came up where, say, like I had to travel across the country at a moment's notice, like I could just do that and it wouldn't like ruin my life in any weird way. But there's obviously lots of people for whom those kinds of decisions would cause a huge, you know, destruction of their quality of life and cause immense pain and suffering, because they didn't have the kind of financial independence that is necessary to live the kind of free lives, the sort of lives free of sort of fear and you know, other sort of negative experiences. So no, I think it's just, and you know, this is obviously what the universal basic income people believe on some level, right? Like if the government can guarantee every, you know, yes, of course you buy that, Matthew, but it's like if the government can guarantee every individual a certain base level of income, then will that sort of guarantee them something approximating the kind of sort of stable financial freedom that we all aspire to, right? Like in government sort of, and it's the same like in this country, right? Like in Canada, right? Like the fact that the government pays for the health insurance, right? Like that's sort of conceptualized as a way to sort of elevate or sort of lessen the kind of financial anxiety that a person might otherwise have if they had to sort of rely on their employer or pay for it out of pocket, right? Like, is there some base level of material you know, need or material sort of independence that we all require in order to live truly free lives? And that's something that I think a lot of conservatives are very hostile to, but much more people on the left are much more receptive to.
I mean, I make pretty good money now too. Like I make more money now than I did as a teacher, which I know that's not much as a teacher. And I also realize now that, hey, like if I have a relative that gets sick, I can go see them. I don't have to like try to, if I like a lot of people, if they try to call in sick at work to take care of their sick relative, they might get fired, and that's not freedom. And also, it's freedom is time. I would say just as much as money or wealth. So that's something to consider as well. You know, you brought up UBI and universal healthcare, which those are two things I like. But I think the biggest reason why I like UBI is it makes it so that people choose what they do with the money. Now, some of them will make poor choices. Most people would recognize that. However, I do think I'm very Jeffersonian in the fact of like, I think I trust people. I think most people will do the right thing. And so that's kind of another reason why I lean on UBI. Of course, to play devil's advocate, you have to recognize that if a government decides to do UBI or even universal healthcare, because the costs are so enormous that the government, whatever, well, let's just say, federal government trying to take something enormous like that on, especially here in the United States where we've never had that, you're going to have a system that's not going to be perfect, and you're going to take away freedoms that people do enjoy right now. It's not much, granted, but there are freedoms that people have that a government system would take away. So we have to acknowledge that as well. That if you do have government intervention, sometimes let's just be honest here, things can go wrong more.
There's been it's interesting. There's been lawsuits. There actually are quite frequently lawsuits in Canada that involve people trying to get the courts to recognize that they have a right to pursue healthcare outside of the government system. So Canada has one of the most extreme public healthcare systems in the democratic world, in the sense that the government requires you to get what they deem to be medically necessary treatments through the government system.
Yes. Yeah,
and you don't have an alternative, right? And so what they've tried to adjudicate through the Canadian court system is if I don't want to use the government healthcare system, do I have a right in the pursuit of my own health to sort of seek, to pay out of pocket to some private clinic or private surgeon or whatever? Do I have that right? The courts have traditionally in Canada said no, because the argument that they make is that by individuals exercising that freedom, you undermine the integrity of the larger system, and that system sort of serves a higher good, pursues a higher freedom of protecting your average Canadian, your base level Canadian, from the anxieties of not being financially secure or not having sort of the freedom from, anxiety or sickness or whatever.
Yeah, no, I can tell you that. Something I was trying to say earlier. Even if I do make enough money to live comfortably now, we're still paying off hospital bills. Every day we get, or every week, I should say, we get a brand new hospital bill in the mail waiting for us, and it's usually hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. So that's something that I know I brought that up to you before, but
another good example though is what Biden did recently with the student loan forgiveness, right?
Yeah.
So it's that also is sort of based on an assumption that there's sort of something inherently oppressive about saddling people with student debt, right? And that he is in some way sort of liberating them from this form of oppression. And actually, when that came up, I remember it was interesting because some people sort of said, well, why not forgiveness for medical bills, or why not forgiveness for just other forms of debt? If we accept that debt is a kind of form of oppression, do we have a right to expect freedom from that?
And the root cause, which conservatives brought up rightly, is that you need to. The problem's just going to keep getting worse because a lot of the reason why we have so much student loan debt is interest. So much of it is so much of payments are just paying interest for decades. But the root cause of that is we have, like myself, a 17-year-old that signed up for this unsubsidized loan from the government. I was an idiot. My parents did co-sign, but they didn't really know much about it either. But regardless, I was like, oh yeah, I had the assumption that if I had a degree, that's an instant ticket to the middle class. Duh. I'll be making so much money that it shouldn't be a problem. And I got a job right out of college, working at a TV station where I was getting paid not much more than minimum wage. And that was a quarter life crisis for me. But regardless, I think that was the main takeaway for me was oh crap, I chose something I wanted to do for a living that I liked. I should have just went for the money, and been miserable or something, but it all turned out okay. But regardless, you could argue that the system in place now makes it so you kind of have to go to college unless you go to certain trades.
Yeah.
A lot of people still don't want to do, unfortunately, but so you have to go to college just to enter the so-called middle class. Yeah, that would be the root cause of the problem we're seeing with the student loan debt crisis.
Was there some sort of because I'm thinking about this now, there was some sort of Supreme Court case involving usury laws. I remember. I don't know if you've done that, right?
I haven't done that.
Have you done that?
No, I haven't.
Oh, but it's like that's an interesting sort of thing as well, right? Where it's just sort of like, do the the folks giving out the loans, the banks or the private entities that are doing this, do they have a do they have a legitimate freedom to charge whatever sort of interest rates they want, or can government sort of set limits on that? Is that a sort of infringement on their freedom, right? Like the freedom of sort of commercial property, sort of commercial players in the private sector to sort of practice their business however they want, right? And so like that was obviously like sort of the big cause of a lot of conservatives, right? Is that government has no right to tell any business, even sort of what we might imagine to be sort of predatory businesses, on how to run their affairs, because they're the right to sort of an unregulated business is sort of like the greatest freedom of them all.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is the case that you're referencing.
Yeah.
Which I don't know much about at all, but if folks watching want to check it out. Yeah, I'll get to some super chats here in a little bit, but I do want to like play the speech. I'm the FDR speech here, just to like, I wonder if the sound will be okay. Let's just try it. Okay. But this is the For Freedom speech that FDR gave. That a lot of his radio addresses kind of reference these four freedoms as well, and his writings as well.
Is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world.
So freedom of speech, essentially, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And the freedom from fear, that last point, we haven't really talked about a whole lot, but that's kind of going back to the security thing, right? Like
well, it's interesting because I often sort of think about this as something that is kind of fallen out of fashion in a kind of tragic way, which is the idea that like it used to be a much more sort of politically mainstream thing to advocate, which was like the idea of world peace, right? Like the idea that somehow we would get to a kind of like peaceful world order in which there would be sort of no, as Roosevelt said, you know, like no weapons, no armies, you know, the kind of John Lennon sort of view of the world. But it's like, even you know, Gorbachev dying the other day, and I saw some clips of, you know, him and Reagan, right? And it's like even well into the 1980s, even somebody like Reagan was like explicitly sort of saying that the long-term goal should just be no more nuclear weapons at all, like complete disarmament of the entire world. And in Roosevelt's time, you know, before nuclear weapons, there was just this kind of idea of like, if there were no standing armies, wouldn't that be great? If there was no, you know, mass proliferation of weapons. And that kind of concept really does sort of seem like not really something that we aspire to anymore. We've become a much more sort of jaded and cynical world, even since the time of the Cold War, which is kind of sad, I think, in a way. The idea that, that freedom from fear is a kind of unrealistic goal, and that we kind of always have to sort of resign ourselves to the idea that we live in a hostile world.
Well, I think that's another. Then I ought to bring this up because one of the organizations that FDR, particularly his wife Eleanor, the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who in my opinion was the most significant First Lady we've ever had, she and him, as well as Wendell Willkie, believe it or not, who ran against FDR in the presidential election in 1940, they all got together, and a bunch of others, of course. They all got together and helped start this organization called Freedom House, which I I don't know if people watching realize this, but when I do my compared videos, I get my data from them. Maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I rely on them too much. But I'm gonna go ahead and share that site. And a trend might surprise you, JJ, in case you haven't looked at this yet. It frankly surprised me when I first. It was a few months ago when I really looked at it. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to do two things at the same time. Okay, so here's the Freedom House website. You can go there. You can see. I mean, it's a nonprofit, but there's the global freedom map. Have you ever looked at this, JJ?
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay, yeah, of course. You're with it. Okay, so I encourage everyone to check this out on your own. But this right here, then at the very bottom corner, you can see 2021 was the 16th consecutive year of decline in global freedom, according to the Freedom House organization. Does that surprise you?
Well, I mean, I suppose it seems kind of consistent with some of the, sort of political analysis that we've been hearing over the last couple of years. We've been hearing a lot about sort of the rise of sort of demagogic populist figures, kind of soft, strong men in parts of the world like Turkey and Hungary and, Eastern Europe and Brazil. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, controversially, people say, sort of Trump fits into this category as well. But that I feel has been kind of one of the themes of sort of global politics of our time, has been sort of the rise of sort of pseudo-authoritarian strongmen, which is to say, like, even somebody like Viktor Orban is, not a dictator, in the sense of like Kim Jong-un or Saddam Hussein, or even by the standards of Vladimir Putin. But there is a sort of sense that like people like Viktor Orban or what's his name in Brazil, right? Like the idea that these are people that just have less deference towards traditional democratic liberties and will run roughshod over some of them. Maybe it's due process, maybe it's, the sort of like scrutiny of elections or just kind of overseers of the independence of different government agencies or the judicial branch or something, that they're just more willing to compromise some of these kind of softer, you could even sort of say more bureaucratized sort of freedoms, the sort of the due process sort of types of freedoms, or the checks and balances types of freedoms that are sort of necessary for a free society. So just given how much we hear about the erosion of those kind of freedoms, it doesn't really sort of surprise me that an organization like Freedom House would sort of say it's on the decline.
Yeah, their big issues are democracies, obviously. How strong a democracy do they have? Like in terms of like how I guess are elections tense times, or are they pretty much like transferring power? Not a big deal. If it's not a big deal, then they're more free, obviously. They also look at media freedom, of course, censorship of not just the press, but the internet in general. Yeah, equality and human rights. A lot of this stuff kind of overlaps. But I think that, okay, so I do want to go back to this map here because does it surprise you that Canada is 98 out of 100 and the United States is now 83 out of 100, which means, according to Freedom House, Canada has more overall freedom than the United States. Who saw that? That surprised me.
Well, I would probably, I would have to sort of look at sometimes these things are very like subtle, right? So like when you look at the map, right, like you see that Canada and the US are both green. Like those are clearly like the good colors. And I think that like to most people, being in a 98 country versus being in an 83 country, like that's probably a distinction that is perhaps too subtle for most people to really notice, versus from going from a green country to a purple country or a yellow country, to go from a truly free country, as both Canada and the US are, to go to a yellow country like Mexico, which is partially free, or to go to a completely unfree country like Cuba. Like, I think that's when you sort of start to notice the significant difference of what it means to live under a different freedom regime versus to sort of say, like, and because it's like the same thing, like, you go, I'm sure that probably Sweden maybe gets a higher mark than Canada, but like I've been to Sweden. When you're in Sweden, it doesn't seem like it's that dramatically different. Is it higher?
It's 100 out of 100, a perfect score.
Yeah. So see, when I've been to Sweden, I've been to the U.S., I've been to Canada. I wouldn't say that when I visit any of those countries, I'm like, whoa, this is a very different society. This country is not as free as I'm used to. But I might think that if I went to, if I went to Mexico, or if I went to Cuba, or if I went to Russia or China or any of these sorts of places, then you sort of see it in a much more meaningful way, because you see how people behave differently when they live under an authoritarian regime. You sort of see the way that a lack of freedom impacts your day-to-day life, as opposed to just, the kind of thing that the newspaper columnists might worry about. What it actually is like to live in a society where you don't have the freedom to sort of freely express your political opinions without, fear of, government reprisal, right? That is something very different. Or the idea that you couldn't just have a sort of spontaneous gathering of people in the park or, in the library without having a government permit, because the government does not recognize a right of free assembly, right? These are kinds of things that we take for granted in the green countries that people in the other colored countries, often envy us for.
And it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that the green countries often are the most prosperous. I mean, you look at most of Europe, in Africa, like the countries that are. I know Ghana is it's a rising star in Africa in terms of everything, and they're 80. South Africa as well, and you look at. I mean, I'm a little surprised actually that Argentina is so high and Brazil so high, but then, I actually wanted to see, why is the United States so low? So if you click on it, you can see the report, and I scroll down here, you can see, looks like internet freedom score is not as high as you would think. Electoral process used to get probably 4 out of 4. Now it's 3 out of 4, probably because of what happened after the 2020 election, I would assume.
Yeah.
And then the other 3 out of 4 was, I guess that's also related to election, public perception maybe of elections. Okay, let's see. 2 out of 4 here. It says, are the people's political choices free from domination by forces that are external to the political sphere, or by political forces that employ extra political means? Interesting. Okay. Basically, it's about the plutocrats, or the oligarchs, basically, that are able to purchase.
See, I'd be curious. So, America gets 2 out of 4 on that. There's no justifiable reason in which you could sort of say that Canada does not also deserve 2 out of 4 on that, because Canada has just as many special interests that dictate the political priorities as much as anyone else. Go to Canada, because this is part of the problem too, is that I often kind of feel like America is analyzed in these sorts of things in a much more critical way than other countries are. Because America's, the biggest country in the world and is subject to a lot more close, I think, scrutiny. And I would imagine that an organization like Freedom House devotes many more resources to investigating the state of freedom in America than they do to investigating the state of freedom in Canada. So what was our rate on that one?
Looks like it has different metrics even. So I don't know.
Is that so?
Yeah, you might be onto something here, because it looks like. It just didn't spend much time on it. So yeah, it was 4 out of 4.
Yeah, see, that seems ridiculous to me. I'm, as my viewers know, I'm in a battle for free expression right now.
Oh yeah,
right, and that is completely being driven by special corporate interests in this country. So all I can sort of say is that they probably did a much sort of more surface level analysis of Canada and a much deeper dive. In part because I would assume, because Freedom House. Is Freedom House fundamentally an American organization?
Fundamentally, yeah. It was started here, I believe. So Americans spearheaded it.
I would have international staff, but I'm sure that they probably have a lot more American staff than international staff.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I feel bad because I want to catch up on some super chats here, because they have some good questions here. So, you mentioned Julian Assange earlier. Thanks for the compliment, Riley. I think this is our personal opinion. I'm assuming. I think Julian Assange. I still kind of lean towards his side that it should have been protected under the First Amendment. Well, I guess he's facing charges in multiple countries, but In terms of releasing classified information, I do believe it was in the public interest. From what I saw, I didn't see everything that he released, but WikiLeaks in general, I think, is a net positive because I think we need to hold governments accountable. Although, yeah, I'm not quite as hardcore as I used to be on that. What about you, JJ?
I mean, I've heard persuasive arguments made by people who know much more about national security than I think either you or I do, who have said that there was like a legitimate national security case against the release of many of the documents that he did, and that he did in fact put American lives in danger, and not like in a theoretical way, but in a very real, demonstrable way. And so I'm kind of inclined to take their word for it when they make those kind of arguments, that the balance, as we talked about before, the balance of competing freedoms was not in his favor.
Okay. Yeah. See, I need to learn more about that. Okay, Harry, thank you. Looks like from Canada. I mean, there is limitation to freedom. The Charter stated that the term reasonable limit, and most people do not think about that when they make outlandish claims.
Yeah. See, this is an important thing about the Canadian Constitution. So, the American Constitution is often sort of interpreted, and I think like sort of certainly lay people interpret it this way, is that the freedoms of the Bill of Rights the freedoms in the Bill of Rights are kind of absolute. And obviously that's not the case in practice. They are qualified and all the rest of it. But the Canadian Constitution explicitly says that they are not absolute. It says that the government can limit freedoms, can subject freedoms to reasonable limits, as can be demonstrably sort of demonstrated in a free and democratic society. It says words to that effect. And what this has meant is that I think in some ways Canadian jurisprudence when it comes to freedom is much less kind of intellectually vigorous than it is in the US.
Yeah.
Whereas like, you read sort of like things like the Jackson v. Dobbs decision, and whatever you think or don't think about it, like there can be no denial that the justices sort of tried to grapple with the kind of the philosophical principles of this and try to make a sort of competing argument about the relative merits of different types of freedom and so on. Whereas in Canada, because the Constitution says that you can just subject freedoms to reasonable limits, the courts in this country are much more likely to just kind of say like, this seems reasonable, like if the government often like if the government makes an even semi-persuasive case, the courts are very likely to sort of say like this falls within the realm of a reasonable limit on individual freedom. It's why, for example, that there have been a number of constitutional challenges against things like mask mandates and vaccine mandates that have been successful in the US that have not been successful in Canada, because the Canadian judicial system has been much more inclined to sort of just kind of blindly shrug and say like, government says this is in the interest of public safety, that seems reasonable. It seems like the kind of thing that the Constitution specifically has this sort of carve out in order to allow, right? Like another sort of big one that my Canadian viewers will be remiss if I didn't mention is that, of course, Prime Minister Trudeau evoked emergency powers to break up that big, trucker protest, right?
Yes.
And, that obviously was very controversial, but they haven't really been sort of successful in challenging it in the courts as well. I mean, as far as I know, this hasn't risen to a real high level constitutional challenge in the courts to date. But I'm pretty confident that even if it did rise to that level, the Supreme Court would be likely to sort of say, well, this was a reasonable limit. The government had a vested interest in breaking up a disruptive process. Ergo, the Constitution's allowance for reasonable limits on freedom was, appropriately applied in this case.
So they basically have an easier job.
Yeah,
sounds like.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it's Sarah. Hey, Sarah. For both of us, do you think there are examples of actions the government can take to increase the freedom of the average citizen? Love yourself. I mean, yeah, I already mentioned UBI. I think would be something that would be the most beneficial if they could find a way where the only major problem with UBI, universal basic income, in my opinion, would be inflationary concerns. I think that's the main negative consequence I see, but and obviously I mentioned universal health care as well, but yeah, what about you?
I definitely think that like protectionism is a great obstacle to freedom. This is something that I think of a lot in the context of Canada, which still has a lot of protectionist laws on the books, right? But it's like when you have protectionism, you're basically saying that certain protected industries have a right to a certain level of profit or market dominance, and that the average citizen does not have a right to, competitive prices born from a free market, right? So I kind of feel like that's breaking down excessive protectionist, pro-corporate sort of legislation. I think is an important way that you can sort of maximize the freedom to live lives of maximum economic independence for your average citizen.
Yeah, it's related and ending corporate welfare, I think, generally to that. Yeah, I agree with you. My viewers know how much I'm a pro-free trader. Okay, next up looks like, oh wow, I missed a few here. Okay. Do you both watch Doka Ryan? He's live streaming now. I don't. I'll start. Oh, genetically modified skeptic still commenting. That's great.
Oh my! I endured this.
It's weird because, like, when you find out you watch each other's channels, it's always trippy. Okay, there's no due process in America if you're a quote climate terrorist, protest for natives. You get no due process as you get that terrorist label. I don't know about that. I have to look more into. Have you heard this label, climate terrorist?
Well, I mean, I think. Well, I mean, but this kind of goes back to what you were sort of saying before, right? Like, I mean, I don't know about the circumstances of this specifically, but when we talk about like the idea that you have different freedoms based on the sort of the type of person you are, there is definitely sort of like less freedoms accorded to people who are criminals or who are terrorists or who are violent, right? Like when you're engaging in sort of subversive behavior of that sort.
Well, they've changed the meaning, and actually the courts have actually changed. Some judges have changed the meaning of the word terrorist. In light of recent mass shootings, that's actually something that you never would have heard this described for someone bringing a gun into a public area and shooting it off.
But it's interesting, like, because like this was obviously something that was big in the early days of the U.S., right, with the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Yeah,
right? Like the idea, like people did not have the freedom to like undermine the integrity of the government or in various ways. And I think that sort of obviously we've gotten rid of most of that, but there are still it still is against the law to engage in conspiracies to overthrow the government or to
Espionage Act is still on the books.
Right? Yeah.
And it's all about the context of, like, if wartime is obviously different than peacetime, and that's generally the argument for the Espionage Act. As much as I hate the law, and that's actually something that's been brought up recently about former President Trump. It's one of those things where if you've got a situation, Abraham Lincoln also during the Civil War suspending the writ of habeas corpus. That's another related thing. A lot of people don't realize he did that. Like, he just threw people in jail. They didn't even know why they were there. But if they were deemed a threat as, like, they're secretly trying to overthrow the government in D.C., then that's what he was doing.
That was also the case with the truckers. In theory, the emergency powers were evoked because the government had reason to believe the truckers were engaged in a seditious conspiracy to overthrow the government.
And public safety, right? Yeah, like although they seemed fairly harmless to me, but although blocking traffic, that's a big freaking deal. Yeah. Good to hear from you, Jax. Yeah, defamation can be defined differently based on interpretation. You betcha. That's another thing. It's always open to interpretation. I mean, that's everything can be interpreted differently when it comes to the law, right? But more with journalists, I generally agree with that. You should side more with journalists. Because I don't know if they say it up there in Canada, but often people call the media the fourth branch of the so-called fourth branch of government. That hold accountable. That whole idea of checks and balances is like another way to check the power of. I think primarily that should be the job of the press. No matter who's in power. Copyright laws. You mentioned copyright briefly earlier. Yeah, I do think they're too strict here in the United States because, I mean, you look at like music is something I always think about, like how it's ridiculously a long time where like your grandkids could be getting royalties from a song you wrote because of copyright law in the United States. I do think that needs to be less strict.
Yeah. It's interesting because I've sort of talked about this a bit in actually some videos that I made. One that was kind of interesting was I made a video about like sort of the iconic American monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Mummy. And there was interesting. There was like some sort of jurisprudence on this, right? Because like in theory, those are copywritten characters that were invented by the Universal Studios people. But, you know, there's obviously like an incessant sort of like you can go, you know, Halloween's coming and you can buy like, you know, your typical bolt-headed Frankenstein mask at the store. And like that's not being released by Universal Studios. But the courts have sort of ruled that these kind of characters have sort of entered the realm of American like folklore, and thus they can't really sort of be fairly understood as the possession of anyone. And sort of sometimes American courts can be kind of interesting in how they rule when it comes to the concept of fair use, right? Which is this sort of like very distinctly, I think in some ways very distinctly sort of American understanding, the idea that sort of things pass from the sort of the corporate sector and into kind of like just the public domain, right? Like the realm of sort of American culture more broadly. The same is true when it comes to things like satire and parody and that kind of thing. Like American
educational videos like we make.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of no, there's a lot of great exemptions because I guess they recognize that there are certain expressive freedom rights that are more important than the right to rigidly enforce copyright to the absolute letter of the law. And I think that's probably a healthy balance.
Should society pay? Oh, these are great questions. I'm glad we're taking these. Should society pay people for restricting their freedom?
Like that's, you can do that, right? Like in the U.S. under the Civil Rights Act, like you can sue the government if you believe your rights have been infringed, right?
Yeah, so, here they may be from. I'm assuming they're from. They're Chelsea fans. Maybe they're from Britain, but here in the United States, it's not just at the federal level, but also a lot of state level laws are like that, where you, in fact, lawsuits are fairly common related to that. Oh, now a lot of times they lose.
But that was like a big advancement, right? Like at the time, like the Civil Rights Act giving because you hear about this all the time, right? Like I think this was even the case with one of the police shootings, right? Is that like the Justice Department opens up a civil rights investigation into, and so like that means that like the Justice Department like investigates the circumstances and then it's like a civil suit, but it's instigated by the government. How does that work exactly?
It depends on. I believe there's a certain threshold. Like they don't just take any case, but I don't know the details of that. But yeah, they've done it multiple times and it always comes down to the 14th Amendment, equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment versus whatever else. But you know, since the 1980s, generally speaking, the federal government has sided more with local governments, in particular police departments. Like, so if you look at cases like Graham v. Connor, the Castle Rock case where the police didn't even have to show up, like that's here in the United States, the police do not have to come if you call them because of that case, which is mind blowing to people when they first hear that. But yeah, so thank you for the donation. The corner. Ooh, that's a terrifying profile pic. We got some really nice people here.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the kind words and for the donations here. Populist politicians care about anything other than the power they are chasing. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's exceptions. Generally speaking, though, I know it's easy to be cynical because a lot of them do care about their power and legacy and wealth more than anything. Sure. As you know, they're humans, you know, but there's exceptions. Is there anybody in Canada that kind of fits the populist definition that you actually admire?
That I admire? Well, yeah. I mean, like the guy who's running to be head of the Conservative Party right now, Pierre Poilievre, who's going to win overwhelmingly next week. Like some people sort of say that he's populist. I mean, I think he's sort of populist in a way that's like much more sort of safe and palatable and consistent with freedom and democracy than perhaps some populists are. You know, the other great sort of populist in Canada, who I don't think much of, is the Prime Minister of Quebec, Francois Legault, who I think is a very sort of populist who has run roughshod over a number of freedoms of Quebecers, including freedom of religious expression in sort of the pursuit of, what he would believe as sort of maximizing the positive right to a certain cultural identity for the French Canadian people. So I think that there's different flavors of populists in Canada as there are in most places.
Well, there's also faux populists. I do think, I mean, essentially that's what demagogues are. A lot of times they're fake populists. They say what people want to hear, but then what they do is different. So how free can one person be when we see, quote, criminal acts prosecuted under, quote, civil law, not criminal courts, such as tax evasion and child abuse? That's a good thing to bring up. That's a good point, Jonna. I think for those of you who have this is over your head, that's okay. What they're essentially saying is like sometimes, well, when we talk about civil law, we're talking about disputes between either individuals or organizations, or individual and organization, or a business or whatever. Like it's a lawsuit typically we're dealing with. Whereas criminal acts, it's somebody is accused by the state for breaking the law, and so sometimes we have situations where someone is actually prosecuted under civil law when they maybe should be taken to criminal. Another thing that a lot of people don't realize here, and I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the United States, I believe it's 93% of people that are who are accused of a crime, a felony, I should say felony, serious crime, just take a plea deal. They take a plea deal. They don't even go to trial. 93%, which is insane. Like we always had this Law and Order mentality, like the TV show, like that's how it is. Everybody gets a trial. Everybody goes to trial. We have all the resources. No, like most of the time there's not even a trial.
Yeah. It's similar in Canada, and I think that when you talk to lawyers, like they view going to trial as a failure on their end, right? Like it's their idea. Their goal is to avoid trial as much as possible and to try to settle things, beforehand through plea deals and such as much as possible. So it's as much a sort of, I don't know, it's a problem with the lawyer culture, I suppose you could sort of say. But it's also like, in fairness to the lawyers and in fairness to the justice system, we live in very large countries now, and sort of resources are limited, and courts can be very long and drawn out and all this kind of stuff. So like there are a lot of lawyers, I think, would view this as a great efficiency of the system, that they're getting sort of results, and often kind of like perhaps even more moderate outcomes than a person might face if they had to face a full trial and jury and so forth.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm still this is a supporter Dante wants us to talk about Christian nationalism, which it's a bit of a, I guess it's related to freedom, our freedom talk, right? Because it's a freedom of religion or freedom from religion. So do you think freedom from religion is just as important as freedom of religion?
It's kind of interesting, and I talked about this a bit actually in a video that I made about sort of the rise of the Christian right in American politics, right?
It's a good video.
Thank you. It's one of my favorite videos that I've made. But it's like the interesting sort of thing now is that, evangelical Christians and even sort of like devout Christians in general in America are much more of an explicit minority than they used to be, right? Like there's obviously like lots of Americans still sort of broadly kind of culturally identify as Christians, but in terms of people who are like living their lives according to like rigid biblical principles and that they do not want to compromise on, like that faction of Americans is much smaller than it's ever been. And as a result, like that faction of Americans, particularly evangelical Christians, I think are becoming much more comfortable using the kind of language of themselves as a kind of beleaguered, unpopular minority that has a right to sort of express their sort of dissident or unpopular sort of religious views, regardless of what the broader public thinks, right? So it's like in the same way that, like Muslims might sort of make the case that they have certain rights as a minority that may be distasteful to the broad public. I think a lot of evangelical Christians are sort of starting to frame their conception of their rights in that way. Like, for example, like the famous Masterpiece Cake Supreme Court case, right? which is the idea that, like, you know, this guy has a right to discriminate against gay people, not because, not because this is a broad sort of conventional social norm that he's sort of playing along with, but precisely because his views are unpopular and are regarded as weird, that it's much more important that we defend his right, because it's his right. In some ways, like, you could even sort of frame it as like, acceptance of gay people is now like much more of the norm than it ever used to be. And so in some respects, he would sort of make the case that like the rights of gay people to have a cake made is much less of a pressing right to uphold than the right of this small, unpopular, beleaguered religious minority in America, as they would conceptualize themselves, to kind of be able to practice their business in accordance with their religious principles. So it's that kind of development in the way that we sort of think of the rights of Christians in America, I think is interesting, and it's probably only going to continue to accelerate in that direction.
Yeah, well put. I would just stress that they are a very small minority that's just loud. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, Christian nationalism is on the rise. I mean, I think because we have some high profile members of Congress that have spouted Christian nationalist talking points, I think that's why there's a concern, but generally I'm not too concerned about it. If you look at every Gallup poll that comes out every few years, it shows that the United States is actually less religious than it's ever been in the history of the country.
But I think one of the issues, though, would be like the Supreme Court, especially this Supreme Court, might be much more inclined to like really have a sort of maximalist interpretation of the rights of religious minorities, especially Christian minorities, right? Like there was like they've had this like, sort of got lost with some of the other, but there were some recent cases that involved this very question.
The Mergens case, yeah, I believe it's the Mergens case that the football coach who prayed on the with his players on the football field during a football game, and he was a Christian. We are seeing some laws. I guess that is a concern. Like in Florida, there's the "In God We Trust" signs that are now in every single school in the entire. But that's kind of an extension of the "In God We Trust" being on every single currency that started in the 1950s. So it is. I guess to be concerned about the Supreme Court. I understand that entirely. The Bills game Thursday night. All right, cool. Balancing of freedoms in airport. Oh, you know what? That's something that, you young folks don't remember. I used to fly before 9/11. That's right. Well, the TSA didn't exist. And I do feel every single time like I'm going to be flying here actually in a couple of days. And it's, you go through that device and they shoot radiation on you, which that can't be good for you. And sometimes they have to fill your body because and it seems random, but they think that you might be a threat. And as it turns out, it's probably just, all just for show anyway. Like they're not really stopping terrorists getting on planes. So yeah, like I do believe I am deeply troubled by the TSA even existing. At the same time, the flip side of the argument is since 9/11, we haven't had any planes fly into buildings, have we? And things have, at least at the very, people feel more safe on airplanes. What do you think?
I've never really sort of like fully understood exactly like what an airport is legally, and to like what extent like people have reasonable expectations of freedom in an airport. Because like an airport is like, it's like, I don't know, like, honestly, I don't even know. Like, I feel ignorant saying this. Like, an airport is like this kind of like pseudo-private, pseudo-government, pseudo-international kind of space in which you just kind of have to like obey weird laws that you have very little freedom to like resist on like due process grounds, right? So,
well, the other weird thing, it's a lot of times it's local government, state government, and federal government all like overlapping each other, intertwined. And so like, I think generally a lot of it's a separate category is what it is. It has to be. Yeah. It's kind of like, but I think it's similar to maybe highways in some ways. Like there's certain things like, I guess there is jurisdiction though with highways though, like, that Yeah, you're right. I never really thought about it too much. It sounds like a future video for you, though.
Well, it's like when you're in weird kind of like bureaucratic spaces, like it can sometimes be very disorienting because you feel like you're being forced to play along with rules and laws that don't exist anywhere else in society. And I think that's part why people get so mad, is because they're not used to being subject to arbitrary authority, which we view as being like the antithesis of freedom.
Yeah. Here's somebody bringing up UBI, and yeah, that is a common critique about it, with landlords and service providers raising rates and wages being lowered. And I think that it's related to the concern about inflation. There's also the concern that people would move to they wouldn't be able to afford to live in cities anymore, and so they'd have to move somewhere else, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I do think that we would see a lot of smaller towns come to life, that are many of them that are dying all over, not just the United States, but the entire world. Like urbanization has been the trend for the last 100 years, or 200 years, really, if you want to talk about the Industrial Revolution. So, I don't know. I think what would happen would be, it would not be all good. Nothing is all good, but I do think the positives still outweigh the negatives. I don't know. Do you have a strong opinion on UBI?
I think that it's just so unlikely to happen that it kind of feels like one of these angels on the head of a pin sort of debates. Like, it's a thing that smart people like to argue about in sort of the abstract, but it would be such an expensive undertaking and so logistically complicated, and just like upend our society in so many ways, which may be beneficial and may be interesting, but it's just, I really do not think government is in the business of pursuing initiatives this grand in the modern age. So I'm always a little bit sort of suspicious of it.
The compromise then is to try it locally, right? Like they did with there's a town called Dauphin, I think, in Manitoba, in the 70s, and Stockton, California is currently doing it. A couple other cities, I believe.
It just seems to me like I just think that, like, when push comes to shove, like, politicians have not been persuaded that the benefits outweigh the costs.
Yeah,
right?
It would have to be. I think it has to be done more at the local level, and we need more experiments to convince them. Why do people seem to hate classical liberalism, and what can we do to? And they hate neoliberalism these days. Neoliberalism is like a bad word, and that
real slur.
I get called that. I think the problem, I think we just need people to realize, like, a lot of what we love about society is because of, classical liberalism, like letting, knowing when to basically let markets function. And for the most part, I would argue most markets need to be free. Obviously there's a certain category, public goods and services, that we all debate on all the time. But I don't know. I think there's an increasing amount, especially Gen Z. I've noticed that, they're all like late stage capitalism and it's all doomed. I don't know. To me, that's way too pessimistic, and you probably would agree with that, I would say.
Yeah, I do. Like, like some of this kind of stuff, like late stage capitalism, something I've been saying for like 100 years. When something's that late, it's probably not coming. But, and like neoliberalism, like these are just kind of like, they're terms that are used increasingly in a very imprecise way to just kind of describe the kind of like the broad vibe of our times, like, so they're not like critiques of anything in particular. It's just kind of saying like, doesn't the modern world seem kind of crappy in kind of undefined ways? Aren't you opposed to that crappiness? And so, like, being opposed to that crappiness is what being opposed to neoliberalism often is imagined to mean in the minds of some of the younger, the sort of the TikTok political commentators. But it's like, if people want to have specific discussions about what aspect of our modern world they want to, reform or abolish or whatever, then let's have conversations about that. But let's not have conversations about just these kind of grand, abstract, philosophical terms that no one can even agree on the definition of in the first place.
Well, and I cringe too, because they'll say late stage capitalism. They'll say like, it's basically they're doomers about everything, like, and then they blame capitalism, and then like the next sentence will literally be, why can't we be like Denmark or Norway And I'm just like, do you realize like they have freer markets than we do, like in many ways. It's like
it's a very important observation, you know. Like I did a video recently where I talked about Francois Mitterrand, you know, who was the first socialist president of France in the mid '90s, right? And it's like many of the socialists in Europe, him among them, reached a very important conclusion that I feel a lot of American sort of socialists are kind of ignorant of, which is the idea that, like, in order to have the robust kind of socialist style public welfare system, you have to have a strong free market economy to support it, right? Like that was the great compromise that the European socialists realized, is that you have to have a free market economy to basically generate the wealth to create the kind of cradle to grave, you know, healthcare system, welfare system, all of the other social security, all of the things that we like and are even more generous than exist in America. But in some ways, like you said, they've been able to create that sort of generosity by having a market economy that in some ways is even less regulated than America's is.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's also extreme wealth inequality, or not extreme, but they have wealth inequality in Europe, just like it's similar to US and Canada. I mean, it may not be quite as extreme, but it's still extreme. And also, they don't, I mean, I think the term they use, they don't even call themselves socialists. It's like social democracy, I think is what.
Yeah. Or like social democrats, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like orthodox socialism, like in a lot of those parts of the world, like orthodox, well, I guess this is the case here as well. Like orthodox socialism is communism or like sort of like state controlled economic planning, which is seen as like discredited. So they've kind of like moved beyond that debate and are into something that I think is more healthy and moderate.
This is an important, somebody from Hong Kong. Thank you for your important question here. Like, a lot of us Americans, or North Americans, have our eyes on Hong Kong and, you know, developments there. And it has been scary to see the erosion of rights there. I don't know, solution. What can we do? What can the rest of the world do for, I mean, it's kind of like asking what can the rest of the world do for Taiwan. You know, it's like it's a tough situation.
Well, I mean, we can make it clear, you know, and this might be cold comfort, but, you know, we make it clear whose side we're on, like explicitly, like we make it very clear that we see ourselves reflected in the struggles of these sorts of oppressed peoples elsewhere in the world, right? That we understand the kind of the stakes of the situation. Right. And, you know, like this is sort of something that I think American foreign policy at its best has always been good at doing, is like just being very clearly sort of articulating that American foreign policy is animated by like American values, which are not only American values, but in some ways are sort of like universal values, that what is good for the people of the United States is good for the people of all countries, and that everybody sort of aspires on some level to have a kind of American style liberal democracy, right? And so when that kind of concept is threatened elsewhere, we are just very clear that in some ways we almost view it as like a threat to our own way of life as well. Right? Because if the principles of democracy are undermined elsewhere, then that sort of gives momentum to the enemies of democracy in our own society. And I do think that when you sort of see, you know, some of like the sort of Trumpy Republicans who envy Viktor Orban's regime, you can sort of fantasize even about bringing sort of Orbanism to American shores. You can sort of say that is a sort of example of how, you know, these sort of erosions of freedom elsewhere in the world do not necessarily stay put. As sort of unfreedom advances, you know, it advances everywhere.
And I think the old Teddy Roosevelt quote, you know, speak softly but carry a big stick. I mean, the United States continues to have the big stick, and I think we can still be diplomatic. But we can still, like, I'm all about talking with dictators and trying to influence them by being nice to them. And I think that generally when we look at, you know, sanctions, it only hurts common people. It doesn't hurt, like it's not going to, sanctions aren't going to make the world more free, as we've seen by the last 20 years. We've had plenty of sanctions. I think it's better to influence leaders directly and hope it trickles down. Oh no, did I just say trickles down? Oh no, sorry. This is more towards, I think, Liz. Okay, so is this the new conservative leader now?
Yeah, the new prime minister.
that took Boris Johnson's place. What's her name? Liz
Truss.
Liz
Truss.
Oh, okay. I need to learn more. Yeah. Well, I can already tell you, I've seen a couple speeches by her, I think, and I think she's pretty in line with Boris, and not in line with Trudeau at all. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, she was sort of considered to come from the kind of the Boris wing of the party, the more conservative wing, in contrast to the fellow that she beat, who from what I understand was sort of framed as the more moderate choice. So she seems like she's the continuity candidate. I don't know that much about her, but I know that, you know, she I think combines has some aspects of sort of Boris's populism. I know that she's sort of considered a kind of like anti-woke kind of person, and like that's a big part of her brand, and that is like a big thing in England as much as it is in America. So I think that the kind of the doubling down on the culture war as one of like the defining aspects of what it means to be a conservative in Britain or America is, I think, sort of something that is probably going to continue under her premiership.
And I know she's a big protectionist, so there's that.
Yeah.
The Book of Enoch. You believe that Christian culture is still a major influence for secular culture in the United States? Yeah, I do. I think so. I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but you know, a lot of Christian culture, I do think it is. I mean, we can't deny that our politicians overwhelmingly are Christian, and throughout much of American history have been Christian, and the founding fathers mostly were Christian. It doesn't mean the laws are, but it does mean, like, remember, a third of the government is how laws are enforced. And so that alone, because, you know, morality shapes ideology, and ideology is often how we govern when people are in power. So, yeah, I don't know. You see the same thing in Canada, maybe? Like,
well, I mean, I think that, like, this is again like when I was sort of talking about like how you don't really sort of like understand what it is to be in an unfree country until you're in a genuinely unfree country. I think the same is true. Like, you know, for example, like I lived in Japan, which is not a Christian society. And you just sort of see like how like the cultural influences that come from the religious heritage, the historic religious heritage, cast a long shadow, even when the society becomes secular. You know, just like a lot of your understandings of just kind of like basic concepts of justice and fairness and, you know, good and bad and, you know, virtuous living versus kind of like, you know, sinful living, right? Like all of these kinds of concepts are just very based in a sort of Christian heritage. And like you even sort of see that like even when you go from like a sort of majority Protestant country like Canada or the US to a majority sort of Catholic country like, you know, Spain or something, like you see in the ways that sort of like Catholic culture has influenced and continues to influence even a very sort of secular European country, just again in sort of terms of the values and the way that people conceptualize different you know, just different philosophic concepts. So I think that, yeah, we will, in some ways, it'll be a very, very long time before there are no remnants of sort of Christianity in our society, regardless of even how many atheists there are.
Yeah, there could be a new religion that takes its place, right? Somebody here is saying neoliberalism is they think it's more of like corporatism, like I mentioned trickle down earlier. I think maybe that's the so a different interpretation of neoliberalism, meaning like more of like turning a blind eye towards big corporations or even corporate welfare, which we referenced earlier. So yeah, I think that JJ and I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I would assume that we would be more sympathetic to, you know, being against corporatism, you know.
Yeah.
Because that's,
I mean, to me, like you can tell when a political term is kind of useless when no one would unironically claim it for themselves, right? Like nobody's going to sort of say like, oh yeah, corporations, they should just run everything. That's my ideology, right? So like if that's the definition of neoliberalism, then it's basically a slur, not a useful category.
Well, speaking of which, and I've actually somebody give a shout out. Have you heard of Ryan Chapman, the YouTuber?
I don't recall.
That's what he specializes on. Yeah, I've watched a couple of his videos, and because I've made a video trying to compare communism, socialism, capitalism, and my thesis in the video is like, yeah, they're basically meaningless terms that they mean different things to different people, and so I actually give an alternate system. But yeah, he has a really good video going in depth about the history of what the term socialism means, and I think he has another video about fascism that I watched, and I also have a fascism video, but he goes much deeper, and he also tries to stay really objective. So I respect that. And
I will subscribe. I just looked at his thing now on my phone.
Yeah.
It looks like he's got high production values and all that. But I do sort of think that, like, I don't know, like, the older I get, sort of the less interested I become in sort of political vocabulary, just because I think it's just so often just used as a tool that people use to beat each other with, as opposed to something that actually contributes in a meaningful way to political understanding, right? So
yeah, preach it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, also like identity. People, especially when you're younger, you're just you want that identity, that distinct identity. And then when you get older, like, I don't even care. I'm comfortable with who I am. I don't need to explain myself to anyone. Although it's funny because you and I both felt obligated to explain our political beliefs, and I think it's because the nature of our videos. Like, you actually influenced me to do that, because I was like, I probably better just get this out there because people are going to call me names regardless. Yeah, like, and I don't know, be as transparent as possible. Yeah, good point there, Riyadh. Yeah, like spreading freedom around the world by bombing countries. That's always I think that's what he's hinting at. Government tyranny versus corporate tyranny. Yeah, we actually at the beginning of the stream we were kind of talking about this, right?
And I think it's a fair point to make, right? Like as I said at the beginning of the stream, most of us, like the sort of the day-to-day oppression, or at least kind of arbitrary authority we live under, is much more likely to be felt through the authority of the employer that we work for, rather than the government that we live under. So I think that when people sort of make arguments about freedom, it's not wrong to sort of use some of that language in the context of employer-employee relations as much as in government-citizen relations.
So would you consider yourself pro-union? Sorry to be so simple, to simplify it so much.
No, I mean, like, I think actually, and I think this is an argument that you're seeing a lot more sort of conservative-minded people make, is that the most legitimate function of a union is to protect workers in a corporate or private employment setting. And what's happened in both Canada and the US is that now the majority of unionized workers work for the government, right? Which is kind of contrary to, I think, the traditional understanding of what a government or of what a union existed to do, which was to fight for these various forms of freedom from this sort of unaccountable oppressive force in society, which was, the bosses, the employers, the corporations, and so forth. And once you have a union movement, when you have a labor movement that is instead entirely defined by just kind of adjudicating relations with the state, and like, a taxpayer funded employer that plays by completely different rules and is subject to like very different forces than a private employer is, I do sort of think that has kind of like warped our understanding of the use of unions, because I think public sector unions are just inherently less sympathetic in many ways.
Yeah, especially teacher unions. They get a lot of flack. Yeah.
Well,
I actually was never in a teacher union. And the reason why I got trash talked about because I never was. But the reason why was actually maybe surprising to you. It's because I felt like they didn't fight for us. Like they didn't do any. Like, why should I give my money to this organization that doesn't do anything? Like, they thought that a victory was our health insurance premiums not going up.
Yeah.
But and this was like every district I worked in. So I could have like actually served in, and not in the union, but I guess I never had the time because I was teaching. But I mean, that's the thing. Like, I do get it. Like, it makes much more sense for there to be unions in the private sector. And also what we're seeing, the trend now is actually, you're not seeing it so much like company wide, you're seeing it at franchisee level. Like you're seeing it individual, like this random Trader Joe's in California and this random Starbucks in New Hampshire, whatever, which I think actually that's the better way to go. Like, it's because, they know each other. They don't have to report to outside chapters, way across the country. So if you're watching this right now and you're thinking about it, it starts with everybody in your workplace talking to each other, knowing exactly what everybody makes. You should always be talking about how much money you make. and teachers, by the way, it's public. You can look it up. Anybody can see how much your local teacher makes. It's all, but it should be like that way everywhere. You should always be talking about it. Don't make it taboo anymore.
It's interesting because, like, you know, the freedom to organize a union, the freedom to organize, you know, this way is sort of been recognized as one of sort of like the great fundamental freedoms of sort of the 20th century, right? Like that's been an important development, is the idea to freedom to organize, the freedom to strike and all that kind of stuff. But it's interesting that like in conservative states like yours, there has also been this counter movement where it's like, well, you also have a freedom, a right to work, right? And a freedom to opt out of unions and a freedom to not give a portion of your salary to unions. And that's I'm actually kind of... I think so. I'm sympathetic to that, right? Because I do think that there is something like a union can very much be a sort of force of arbitrary authority if you don't want to, something that is taking a portion of your paycheck. And particularly like if it's kind of like large and very unaccountable union where you don't know where the money is going and you don't really feel you have much control over what they say or do, then I mean, that can be just as oppressive. As you sort of said, often, and you know, my mother was a teacher and I saw the way that she would complain about the union that she was a part of, and the idea that you're just kind of asked to give kind of blind deference, that the union is doing this or that on your behalf, but you know, if it's this large, you know, like in British Columbia, for instance, like the teachers union reflects the entire province. It's no longer just by school district to school district. There's like one giant union for the whole province. And you're just, you know, you give money and it kind of goes into this unaccountable black hole and the union says that they're doing good things with it. But, you know, that can feel arbitrary as well, just as the employers sort of, you know, taking stuff from you can feel arbitrary.
Like freedom to me.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to go just a few more minutes, everybody. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up. So this person's inviting you to for Thanksgiving in rural Arkansas. So that's really good.
That would be lovely. I would love to have a good American Thanksgiving one day. Oh,
man, yeah, it's such a great holiday. Oh, Briggs. Hey, I actually got to meet at Briggs recently. Great guy.
Oh, yeah?
Subscribe to his channel. Most dictators see being nice and being weak. As someone who has landed on a few shores in my day, he was in the military. It has always seemed to me, when we get aggressive to dictators, they change their tune. Yeah, I mean, I guess I shouldn't say a blanket statement over about all. I mean, obviously, it has to be case by case. You're talking about diplomacy. Thank you, Hover. Yeah, what a lot of great comments. Yeah, the whole "In God We Trust" thing. I think is there anything like that in Canada? Where like
the very first line in the Canadian Constitution says that Canada is a society that is founded under the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Right. So like the idea is that, and like, because it's important to understand that when a lot of this kind of stuff was written, like people sort of conceptualized God in a slightly different way than we do now. Like they didn't think of it like now. I think when you see like "In God We Trust" or God in the Constitution, it seems like this is like the explicitly like right-wing Christian God. Right. Whereas in the older days, I think there was kind of a sense, and like this is kind of a dated conception, but the idea that like it was impossible to conceptualize like a society with laws without an idea of God, like that God, even just like as an abstract principle, like an organized democratic society had to have, you know, the supremacy of God is like its highest sort of organizing, you know,
it goes back to John Locke, and John Locke always talking about like natural law, like it comes from I think he said providence was the term, like that's what a lot of the because a lot of democracies are like, well, you know, there's just certain things that come from, you know, that all humans have. And it was such a new thing to talk about. I think that it was easier if they could just say, oh yeah, God said it's okay.
Yeah.
God, we call them, we talk. Yeah. So that's why it's cool. Like, that's why we're all equal and stuff, which is a radical idea. Tier Zoo. Holy crap. Tier Zoo.
Buddy.
Yeah. Check out Tier Zoo.
Thank you, Tier Zoo.
Patrick there. He's got a great channel. My daughter really liked the wolf episode or the dog episode. Just want to say you're both cool dudes. Thank you. Just finished binging JJ's entire video catalog. The entire video catalog. That's a lot of videos. That's like,
I know. I get messages from people who say that, and I cannot imagine doing that. Like, I have so many videos, and like, and some of them are so old and bad, and like, I can't imagine someone like really just making it their project to watch every single one of them. But I salute them if they have.
How can you put up with me for so long?
Exactly.
more kind words. Like, I guess we need to do more streams together.
It's fun.
Yeah, no, this has been great. So since we just have a few minutes, I know I sent that document. Is there anything else we wanted to bring up before we signed off tonight? I know we mentioned FDR, we briefly mentioned Reagan, but we didn't really talk much about Reagan and what his view of freedom was. And
well, we sort of talked about the conservative side of conception of freedom. I think that conservative conception of freedom emphasizes the freedom of business and sort of national security sort of based conception of freedom much more than perhaps people on the other side of the political spectrum do. But
yeah,
some of that has declined a bit. Like the right wing, the Republicans are much more populist economically than they used to be. They're much more comfortable, at least rhetorically, sort of demagoguing against big business than they ever were in Reagan's time. You know what's actually a sort of weird sort of thing that I learned recently? The Republicans at one time were like really big apologists for like those multi-level marketing scams. Amway.
yeah,
Like, Amway was the guys that ran Amway were like big Republicans, and the Republicans loved Amway because even though it's we now look at it as kind of like a scam and a hustle, at the time and sort of the Reagan epoch, it was sort of seen as this is freedom of business. These are small entrepreneurs, and business shouldn't get in their way, or sort of government shouldn't get in their way. And if people kind of want to do whatever they want to do, then it's not our place to judge, right?
Kind of like that gig economy today, right?
I guess so. Although, I feel like Republicans today are perhaps a little bit more willing to be judgmental of that kind of thing. Like the idea of that business deserves nothing but kind of unqualified praise on its own terms, as opposed to, obviously a lot of this is kind of tied up into kind of culture war stuff, right? The millionaires are too woke or whatever, and that's why we hate them. But but I don't know, just the kind of the romanticization of capitalists and free market heroes is just seems like less of a thing than it used to be.
We haven't brought up taxes much or at all. I do have a video. I don't want to plug my stuff all that much, but I do have a video that goes through all the major types of taxes. And that's another thing that really got me thinking about okay, what are my own values in terms of, I've always strongly been against the income tax, and I still am. However, something I've kind of changed my mind on over the years is a wealth tax of some sort. And I used to just always associate it with income tax. They earned it, they have to keep it. Otherwise, that's taxation is theft, yada, yada. However, once you understand how wealth is actually, quote unquote, earned, you realize it's actually not really earned. Much of it is not earned. It's passed down. The video I released recently about what is a self-made person. I always used to have, it's kind of rooted in the American, almost the myth of it's the American dream, right? Everybody has the opportunity here to earn a fortune if they work hard enough. However, the older I get, the more I realize that actually that's, the George Carlin was right when he's like, it's a dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. It's actually not true. It's the vast majority of wealth is passed down. And we see success stories, but then you dig a little deeper and you realize that the mom and dad had a little bit of support there, or they at least had a middle class. They at least started out in at least the middle, where they were never in a situation where they didn't literally have food to eat, or So me I'm a perfect example. My parents were not rich or anything. We had a middle class life, but I think that it was good enough. We never had to worry about eating, having enough food on the table. And I think about, well, would I be as successful today if I was somebody, if I had scarcity or trauma, especially trauma. I didn't have much trauma growing up. Boy, how freaking lucky I am. I didn't have to experience it. So, that's another, I guess, a lot of what we perceive to be fair is actually not so fair at all. And because of that, maybe a tax that seems unfair on its surface maybe is actually not as bad as we think.
if it's like you're basically making the case for like redistributive taxes specifically.
Well, assets, specific assets, or specific like a death tax. I understand. Like I used to be like, they called it a death tax. Like estate tax is essentially like when you pass down assets to your next of kin, the government takes in and snatches part of it and redistributes that. I used to be strongly against that. Now I understand more about, okay, what? Yeah, it kind of makes sense. You didn't earn that,
This is going to be, I predict that this is going to be one of the big sort of political debates that's going to continue in recent or in sort of coming decades, because frankly, as the parents of our generation die off, I think that there's going to be a massive kind of a newfound inequality in our generation, because you're going to get some people whose parents are very property wealthy, because of course the boomers have like very inflated property values. And then sort of like there's going to be some millennials that are going to inherit a ton of wealth when their parents die. And then there's going to be some millennials that are going to inherit very little. And there's suddenly like overnight, some millennials are going to become super millionaires and then some will not. And this will sort of be seen as like this kind of like overnight force that has just randomly and arbitrarily made some people much wealthier than others, all just based on the inheritance of their parents, who, again, are often largely wealthy through property, not through, other sort of forms of means.
So the question remains: will these millennials, like us, will they, the ones who inherit a lot, will they recognize that they are lucky, or will they act entitled? Like I deserve this. That's the question.
Yeah, I don't know. I just know that it's very unusual for people to argue in favor of taxation on themselves.
Yeah, myself included. I get it. I totally get it. Okay, yeah, no, leftist creators. I keep getting, there's somebody on the Discord my Discord server that wants me to chat with Destiny, who apparently is left leaning, I guess.
I think Destiny, actually, I mean, I don't know him super well, but I think he's much more of a sort of like traditional liberal.
Okay,
classical,
more towards the center. So we probably would get along pretty well. Yeah, I would love to chat. Plus, Destiny and I went to the same college. So
is that so? That's very cool. He's very combative, but he's like a pretty sort of partisan Democrat in the sense like that he wouldn't be one of these like far left people who sort of says the Democrats aren't left wing enough and I hate them for that. But like he's supposedly a very good debater. I haven't seen very much of him though.
I know, like some of the ones on the left they're just a little too, I mean, kind of what we were talking about earlier, the late stage capitalism folks.
Yeah.
But
it's a bit exhausting.
Yeah, I would like to chat with him. I don't know who else though. Destiny's annoying. I liked his when he had a little debate with his mom in the kitchen. I caught that live stream. That was a classic. Okay, well, we will wrap it up here. Any final thoughts about freedom, Mr. McCullough?
It was a good conversation. I feel like we were able to explore the concept of freedom from many angles, which is, I think, the way it deserves to be explored. Because as we've hopefully made clear tonight, there is not one conception of freedom, and freedom is not simply a matter of like some sort of abstract good that you can either have a lot of or a little of, right? Like it's something that manifests in so many different ways in so many different realms of life, and often different kinds of freedoms exist simultaneously or are in conflict with each other. So if it was as simple as just like create the perfect society with the perfect amount of freedom, we'd all have done it by now. But it's precisely because freedom is such an imprecise concept that we're always struggling to define and balance and get right, that we can never achieve complete sort of social peace or harmony, and why it will always be, I think, one of the defining struggles of any democratic society.
Yeah, dang it, how do I follow that up? Crap, that was really you're more eloquent than I am. But yeah, I did post this link in the description that I'm displaying right now. There's quotes that from famous folks all talking about freedom, and I think what you said about how it means something different to different people. And it's incredibly complicated because oftentimes when we talk about freedom, it is a zero-sum game. Like it's almost like an equation, like you have to plug in because the end result we want is more freedom for everyone. But sometimes you have to take away freedom from one person in order to give more freedom to more people.
Yes.
So yeah, if you think about it in mathematical terms, which is kind of weird, that might be the better way to do it. But anyway, here's some random quotes that. Yeah, see, a lot of this stuff, though, the more you really think about it, it's like, yeah, that's kind of meaningless.
Well, it's freedom is it's a flowery romantic term that has been the subject of so much sentimentality, often cheap sentimentality, right? Where it's like, if you can just come up with some sort of catchy turn of phrase about freedom, you'll be celebrated as a great, wise philosopher, intellectual, whatever. But as you sort of see I was looking at this page actually earlier, and there's often kind of like little snippy comments that people have left in response to these seemingly eloquent statements of freedom. But
I saw that too.
There's freedom.
We can all just relate to the Braveheart. Freedom.
Yes.
That's maybe, but so I think if we can remember at least that the end goal for, I think, pretty much everyone, no matter what their political ideology or leanings, is freedom.
Yes.
And if we can stop just pointing fingers and calling each other authoritarian when really none of us are authoritarian. Well, okay, maybe 1% of us are, but the other 99% kind of want the same thing. It's just that, yeah, it's not. It's messy. It's complicated. So anyway. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Matthew. It was a lot of fun.
It's always a pleasure. Yeah. Hey, and I'll keep this up for everyone to watch later if you want to. Thanks for being here, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, my friend.